I want to welcome you, and I would like to introduce myself because I realize it's been a few months since I've been here, and some of you, maybe you've recently joined the Tree.Church, but my name is Anthony Lombardi, and I'm the campus pastor at the Logan campus, and it really is so great to be back with you. I think it's been about 3.5 months since I've been here on a Sunday morning, obviously because I've been down at Logan, and I just wanted to briefly share a few things about that. As you know, last week we baptized nearly 30 people at our first baptism service, which is just incredible. Our attendance last Sunday was 839 people, which is just incredible to think about. And so there's just so many good things happening. We're seeing new people, new families, new children every single week. We have tons of people week in, week out coming to guest reception to get connected to the church. And I say all that not only to celebrate you and let you in on what is happening, but also to say thank you because many of you are financially investing in the work of the ministry here at the Tree. Many of you were a part of the Not Coming Down or still a part of that Not Coming Down campaign. And because of your generosity, because of your sacrifice, a community that you don't live in is being deeply impacted by the good news of Jesus right now. And so I want to thank you for that because God is doing incredible things in Logan, and it's really such a privilege to be there and see it unfolding before our eyes. And so it really, really is incredible, and we are grateful for your investment in the things that are happening. But in saying that, I really am glad to be back, glad to be able to teach this morning. And several weeks ago, I gotta be honest, I was curious as to what I was gonna be teaching on, and we have a teaching schedule, and so I knew that this was my date, but I didn't know the topic. And as you know, we've been in this series, Following Jesus, looking through the Gospel of Matthew, so I was curious. And honestly and selfishly, I was just thinking, man, I hope it's like an encouraging message, because it feels kind of like a family reunion. I haven't been here in a while. And so lo and behold, I look and find out the passage is in Matthew 23. I look it up, and Pastor Matthew graciously assigned me the topic of religious hypocrisy. So thank you, Pastor Matthew. He even made a joke about that earlier this week. By the way, this is your time to leave the auditorium now that you know what we're gonna be talking about. How many of you have heard someone say the expression, it's not about religion, it's about relationship? How many of you have heard someone say that, or maybe you've said that before? For many years, many in the church would use that as a way to kind of characterize what the Christian faith is all about, right? It's not about religious rules or rituals, it's about this relationship that we have with Jesus. And yet even today, those outside of the church, those who are not necessarily Christians, I've seen maybe even celebrities frame it this way. You will see this expression being used that is different and yet similar. It's this idea of, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. How many of you have heard people say that before? I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. Now, if you've said that, I'm sorry to break it to you. If you look up the definition of spiritual, it's literally relating to religion or religious belief. So you're religious whether you realized it or not, apparently, if you're spiritual. But I bring that up because in both of those statements that I think are fairly common or have frequently been used, there is this aversion to the idea of being religious. Right, there's something about us that is reluctant to be associated with religion or being characterized as a religious person. And the reason why I think that is because our preconceived ideas of what that means is almost entirely negative. Right, we have this stereotype that if you're a religious person, you're a person that nobody really wants to be around, if we're being honest. Like if you're a religious person, we associate that with several different things, and none of them are good, right? The religious person is the person that is self-righteous, right? They think they're maybe superior or better than others. The religious person is a person who's judgmental, always looking down or pointing out the flaws in other people. Ironically, the religious person is not only the person who thinks that they're morally superior, simultaneously, they're also hypocrites because their own glaring sins in their own lives are ignored while everybody else's are being pointed out. The religious person is this stereotype of a belligerent, in-your-face type of personality, and yet a person with little self-awareness, the type of person that cares maybe more about tradition than they do about how a person feels. And so we have this idea of a religious person really being very negative. How many of you have watched the show at some point in your life? You've watched the show The Office. How many of you love the show The Office? How many are like the person, they're like, I can't do The Office because I don't like stupid humor? I'm sorry, your opinion is wrong on this one, okay? The Office is phenomenal. All right, the Office, though, really what makes that show is all of the different characters and their interactions with each other, right? You have Michael Scott, who is the least self-aware person on planet Earth, right? He thinks he's a great manager. He thinks everybody loves him, and yet he's belligerent, he's annoying. He is completely unaware of how people actually perceive him. He's completely unaware of how inappropriate he is at times. You have Jim Halpert, who's kind of the prankster in the Office, always using humor to kind of deal with life. You have Dwight Schrute, who is so serious that you can't take him seriously, right? He's just a character in and of himself. You have Stanley, who's kind of grumpy and irreverent at times. You have Creed, who has no idea what planet he's on most days, right? He's done far too many drugs in his past life, and he doesn't know where he's at. You have all these other characters, but there's this one character on the show that to me is the least enjoyable, and it's Angela. Does anyone else agree? Like, Angela is the worst character on the show. She's the worst character on the show because she's not fun. She's not enjoyable to be around. The irony is she's characterized as the religious person in the Office, and yet all of the things that characterize her, right? She's mean. She's not gracious, she's critical, she's judgmental, she feels morally superior to everybody else, she's not fun. Like, she adds nothing redeemable to the culture of the Office on the show. She's the person that really nobody wants to be around. And yet she is this stereotype or this caricature of what a religious person is. And so there's something deep inside of us where we recognize we don't want to be that person. We don't want to be around people like that. Some of us in this room, maybe you've been hurt or wounded in your past by someone who was like that. Like, they did damage to you, and even maybe for a season, your view of Christianity. And I think that's right in the sense that Jesus himself comes hard against people who model this type of behavior. If you have a Bible, in Matthew 23, we're going to be looking at what Jesus says in addressing these individuals known as the scribes and the Pharisees, right? These were the Jewish religious leaders, the religious elites of the day, those that others would have looked up to as really the pinnacle of Jewish faith, right? The idea of religiosity in a positive sense. And yet what Jesus says in today's passage is nothing positive. We find what is called the 7 woes to the Pharisees and the scribes. And so I want to start in Matthew chapter 23, starting at verse 13. Jesus says, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, for you neither enter yourselves nor allow others, those who would enter, to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves." Anyone else like, whoa, take it easy, Jesus? Child of hell? Like, I've been insulted before, but being called a child of hell by Jesus has to sting. Like, I can honestly say I've never called anybody a child of hell before. What I can honestly say is that I haven't thought it, particularly about my own children. When you have 4 small kids, for those of you who are judging me right now, you either don't have kids or you have perfect children, because I promise you, if you've been a parent at any point in your life, you've felt that deep in your soul. Jesus calls them, right, a child of hell. And so what is happening? The statement of woe that we're gonna see show up multiple times, 7 times to be precise, is this intense statement. It's a statement of sorrow, grief, anger. It's a statement of denunciation, right? He's denouncing the Pharisees, the religious leaders, their attitudes, their heart posture, their behavior, their motivations. In other words, Jesus is calling them out because these are the individuals who were supposed to represent God to the Jewish people. Not only were they supposed to represent God, they were to be the ones to teach people about God. To literally be a scribe and a Pharisee was to be an expert at the laws of God. And so they were supposed to not only represent God, but to point people to God. And what Jesus says here is that they are doing neither. They are actually misrepresenting God, and they're ultimately keeping people from him. Now, how are they doing this? First, they made their own standards of righteousness. One of the things that the Pharisees and the scribes would do is that they would basically make rules around the laws of God. And over time, they basically just lump these in as if these were commands from God himself. And so the standards were so high. What Jesus is saying is you've effectively excluded yourself and you've excluded others by adding up all these standards of righteousness that have nothing to do with God, but are your own preferences, your own opinions, and your own standards. And you can't meet them because they're impossible, and neither can anyone else. And so there was this false metric of righteousness that excluded, according to Jesus, themselves and everyone else. Secondly, Jesus addressed this idea of making a proselyte, which would have been someone who was a Gentile, a non-Jew. So this was someone who converted to Judaism. So they would make these converts. And what Jesus is saying here is he's saying those who do embrace the faith are embracing a misunderstanding, a deception of the faith, because all of the things that you are getting wrong, you are essentially multiplying as these people are being converted into your wrong way of thinking, into a misunderstanding of who God is, into a misunderstanding of how you're supposed to live and how you're supposed to operate. And so those who had a sincerity to them, who were being converted, were ultimately being deceived. They were being misrepresented by the religious leaders in that they were teaching them false things. And so Jesus is saying you've missed God and you've excluded yourself, you've excluded others, and others you've misled. And so here's the first thing that I want to point out that Jesus is saying. False religion creates barriers instead of building bridges. False religion creates barriers instead of building bridges. I want you to think about what a barrier is. A barrier is something meant to keep something or someone out. In the last couple years during the presidential election, President Trump talked about something that was this, kind of highly volatile topic. It was about building the wall, the border of the United States and Mexico, right? And the entire rhetoric was about keeping out illegal aliens to come into the country. And so the idea was building a wall would be this barrier that would ultimately keep the United States secure. That was the conversation around it. And so this idea of putting up a wall to keep people out. On the other side, I want you to think about the purpose of a bridge. The purpose of a bridge is the exact opposite. The purpose of a bridge is to create a pathway to give access to something that wasn't accessible before. Right? If you've ever been on a road trip or gone on vacation before, and I love this, especially with kids, because they get a kick out of driving over a bridge. You'll notice oftentimes a bridge goes over a deep ravine, valley, oftentimes over a river or a body of water, right? It makes access to something where there wasn't access before. It creates a pathway. And what Jesus is implying here is really any religious mindset that is bent on or focused on keeping people out rather than showing them the pathway in is a system that is fundamentally opposed to the heart of God. It is missing the point. And this is what Jesus is saying about the religious leaders. They were so focused on themselves and their standards, they were ultimately and effectively keeping a barrier between themselves and God and between others and God. And so Jesus makes it abundantly clear that they did not understand God, and that's why they behaved in this way. But this is also why Jesus himself was so opposed to the ways of the religious leaders. One of the things that we see with Jesus is he hangs out with sinners and outcasts and broken people, the very people that made the religious leaders angry. In fact, when they saw Jesus doing these things because of their whole mindset around religion, they were frustrated and they didn't understand because they had missed the heart of God. And so they were concerned about keeping people out and setting their own standards, and yet Jesus was concerned about inviting people in so that they could truly experience God, his love, his acceptance, his forgiveness, his mercy, his healing. And so here's the question. One of the ways that we might be a religious hypocrite and not know it is asking yourself this question. Do you see yourself more as a guide, or do you see yourself more as a bouncer to the Christian faith? Do you see yourself more about inviting people in, or do you see yourself more about monitoring who needs to be kept out? I want you just to imagine for a moment this morning as you were walking across the parking lot to come into the church, as you approach the doors, you notice there's a couple large men, 6'6", 6'7", 300 pounds, covered in tattoos, and they tell you as you approach, they tell you, sorry, we can't let you into the church today, and if you try to get in, we are going to use force to resist you. Now, how many of you are still trying to get in? Most of you are cutting your losses. You're like, all right, I guess I'll just not go to church today. Right? Now that's a funny image, right? The idea of having bouncers at the door of a church. Physically speaking, that's a humorous image. And yet there would be many who would say that that's effectively how they have felt by some Christians. That this idea of being excluded, kept at bay, not welcomed, not invited in. And oftentimes this comes from a form of self-righteousness and legalism where our opinions and our preferences become the standard in which we judge everyone else and whether or not they're worthy to be included, whether or not they're worthy to be invited. And when they don't meet our standards, we look down upon them or we question them or we condemn them, right? All kinds of different things. The way that people dress, whether or not someone wears a hat into church, their worship style, the translation of Bible that they use, the political affiliation, whether or not they have questions or doubts about their faith, all of these secondary things, whether or not they let their kids go trick-or-treating, and we think they celebrate Halloween. We have all of these additional things that we use to make judgments about people. And this is exactly what the religious leaders were doing. This critical spirit, this mindset where we are willing to exclude others. It's the mindset that scoffs at the guy who leaves church only to go outside and smoke a cigarette and thinking to ourselves, I can't believe that guy's smoking a cigarette right outside of church. Not realizing he's 2 months clean from heroin, that he's a work in progress, that God has brought him to this place. And so we often can have this mindset where we miss the heart of God. And this is what was happening with the religious leaders. Now, I'm not saying that we should simply relax God's standards or have no standards at all, because the reality is there is an offense to the gospel. There is a call that says we are sinners and we are called to repent and we're called to surrender our lives to Jesus. And yet what I'm saying is that we don't make our opinions and our preferences and our standards the thing that we judge others by, the thing that allows us to, rather than invite people, but to exclude them, to give them a place where they can belong rather than expect them to behave before they belong, knowing that they're invited in and we allow God to do the transforming work in their lives and in their hearts. And so this is one of the first things. If we care ultimately more about that than we care about seeing people saved, we might have a false religion that is not from the heart of God. Here's the second thing. Jesus goes on in Matthew 23, verses 16 through 24. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, if anyone swears by the temple, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that has made the gold sacred? And you say, if anyone swears by the altar, it is nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift that is on the altar, he is bound by his oath. You blind men, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it. And whoever swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. It's a good thing that Jesus made his speech a little bit easier on them the second round. So Jesus here, he's addressing some sort of practice that we're not fully aware of what it was, but those who would go into the temple and they would make these oaths, they would swear an oath. And there was some debate as to what made the oath valid or what made it binding, depending on what they would swear on, right? So they would make this oath and they would swear on different items within the temple, and there were certain things that were forbidden and other things that they thought were valid. And so this entire conversation around the gold or the gifts versus the altar, that's what Jesus is addressing. But their reasoning is distorted because they're splitting hairs and they're missing the point that they're focusing on the lesser things, not realizing that these oaths that they're making in reference to God himself. And so what Jesus is saying is you are obligated because you're swearing these oaths, and all of these things ultimately point to the reality that is God. And so you're splitting hairs and you're being selective in your mindset, but you're missing the point. You're missing the actual priority and what is really sacred and what is really central to what you're saying, which is that you're making these oaths that are actually bound because you're making them in reference to God. Then he goes on and addresses a similar but different topic. He draws out their inconsistent obedience, like that they're fulfilling in great detail some aspects of the law, specifically tithing. So they were called in the Old Testament law to be able to tithe on all of their spices, all of the things that they brought in. And so he says, all of these fine herbs, the mint and the dill and the cumin, you're tithing on all of them, and yet you're forsaking the other aspects of the law, the weightier matters that Jesus calls them, which are what? Justice, mercy, faithfulness. So there's this selective posture where they're doing some things, but they're actually missing the main point. And so here's the second thing that I want to point out. False religion fixates on small things while forgetting the crucial things. False religion fixates on small things while forgetting the crucial things. And I love that Jesus uses this humorous illustration to point this out. He says, you guys, you've strained out the gnat, but in the process, you swallowed the camel. And in Hebrew, it's even more humorous because the words are very similar. Gnat in Hebrew is galma, and camel is gamla. So he's saying you've strained out the galma, but you've swallowed the gamla. You've strained out the gnat, but you've swallowed the camel. You've done the little things, the insignificant things that are easy, but you've missed the heart of the law. You've missed the heart of God. You've missed the things that are most important, that are crucial to what this is really all about. False religion fixates on small things while forgetting the crucial things. Oftentimes, this is what leads to a moral superiority, right? We do the bare minimum, or we do certain things that make us feel good, and yet we miss the core essentials of what Christianity is really all about, which is loving God and loving people. And we check off certain boxes of things that we're doing, and we feel good about ourselves because of that. And Jesus is saying, but you've missed the point. You've missed my heart, and you've missed what I'm actually calling you to do. I would say this, false religion is usually more selective than it is surrendered. Meaning we pick and choose, we prioritize some things while clearly bypassing other things. And yet what Jesus would call us to is a surrendered heart posture, a surrendered life. To say, I'm not gonna just pick and choose between some of these things, but God, I want to do all of what you are asking of me. I wanna have a surrendered heart and posture. As it is, we're missing the main point. It would be like this. Imagine, some of you in this room, you might be a realtor, but imagine you're a realtor and you're prepping a house for a potential buyer. And you spend all of your time at the front door. You repaint the front door. You spend hours polishing the brass doorknob so that when that buyer comes up to the door, that's the first thing that they see. And so they come up and they open the door only to find nothing inside has changed, and that house happened to be owned by a hoarder. And so they walk in, at first seeing this beautiful front door, and everything else in the house is trashed and full of garbage. Right, and they think, what in the world? I'm not gonna buy this house. And you say, but did you see the front door? Did you see how shiny the doorknob was when you came in? Right, that's what Jesus is saying. Like you missed the main point. You missed it. You missed the heart of God. And so often, one of the ways that this shows up is, again, we will fixate on the sins of other people and minimize our own. So one of the things that we'll look at is, well, I don't sin in that way. I don't struggle with that thing, and we feel good about ourselves. Or we'll focus on the things that we are doing. Well, I go to church most Sundays, while ignoring the things that we know God is calling us to do. A posture that God has called us to take with him and with others. And so we look at these minor aspects of our lives and we feel good about ourselves while ultimately missing the main point of what it means to live a surrendered life, fully following after Jesus and what he has for us, and how he calls us to live, how he calls us to interact or treat people. And I'm not saying here that some aspects of obedience are optional. Like, that's not what Jesus is saying. In fact, he says the opposite. He says you should tithe on the mint and the dill. You should do all those things without neglecting the weightier matters. In other words, you should be doing those things, but not to the neglect of justice and mercy and faithfulness. Because if you miss those things, then you missed all of it. Doing all those other little things serves no point. Like, it serves no purpose. If anything, that should be the byproduct of a person who wants to truly honor God in every aspect of their life. Not simply be selective, not simply choose the things that are more easy to deal with or the things that are more convenient to fit our lifestyle. And so Jesus is really saying it's easy to compare ourselves to maybe our own standards or the standards of others and feel good about ourselves rather than measuring ourselves to God's standard and what it is that he's calling us to do, what it means to live a surrendered life of full obedience to him. And so this is the second thing that Jesus addresses. Moving on in the passage in Matthew 23, verse 25, he continues, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly appear beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanness. So you also outwardly appear righteous to others, but within you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness." So Jesus gives two different images and illustrations here, really talking about the same reality. He talks about these cups and plates, right? These dishes, and he's saying, like, you clean the outside so that the outside looks good, but the inside is disgusting, right? The inside is full of garbage. How many of you have ever, much to your dismay, you've opened the dishwasher in your kitchen after a load of dishes has been done. You've opened it to pull out a plate, getting ready to put it in, to realize that some of last night's dinner is still stuck to the plate. How many of you just put that away in your cupboard? If you raise your hand, I'm never coming to your house for dinner, just know that. No, usually what do? We put it back in there to wash it again, or maybe we wash it by hand to make sure it's clean. Why? Because you don't want to use a cup, you don't want to use a plate that's not clean. It doesn't matter what it looks like on the outside, because it's not functional if it's not clean. This is what Jesus is saying. You're focused on the outside, not realizing that the inside is unclean. You're focused more on what people see rather than what God sees. And so he reiterates this truth with another illustration. He talks about these tombs, these elaborate, beautiful tombs. It says on the outside, they look attractive. On the outside, they look beautiful. On the outside, they're a work of art. But on the inside, there's a decomposing body. And Jesus said, that's how you are. On the outside, you look clean. On the outside, you look good. But on the inside, you are full of everything that is opposed to the heart of God and the ways of God. There's a disconnect between what is being portrayed on the outside and what is actually going on in the inside. And Jesus had talked about this before, actually early on in the Gospel of Matthew, in Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. He talks about these topics of praying and fasting and giving. And in each of those topics, he says specifically, do not do what the Pharisees do. Do not do what the religious leaders do. And then he proceeds to tell them what they do. That they're praying in public in order to be seen by others. They fast and they disfigure themselves to make it known to everyone that they're fasting. They give and do acts of generosity for what purpose? To be seen by others. They're concerned with getting the praise of people. They're concerned with their outward reputation. They are not truly concerned with honoring God. And Jesus says, do not be like them. In fact, the very term used for hypocrite is a word in the Greek that was used of someone who would be a part of a theater play, right? In other words, they were playing a part. And so Jesus is saying, you are playing the part. You're making sure outwardly you look good for other people, but God knows what is really going on in the inside. And here's the third thing. False religion prioritizes outward appearance over genuine righteousness. False religion prioritizes outward appearance over genuine righteousness. For us, we might call this Sunday Christianity. That the entire basis maybe of our Christian faith is occasionally showing up to church. Or maybe we post some Bible verses on Facebook, right? Maybe occasionally we do some church-related events, and yet there is this disconnect from the rest of our lives. Like there's a lack of integration of the faith that we claim to believe and how it should be informing our day-to-day lives. the way that we treat our spouse, the way that we love our children, the way that we run our business, the way that we treat fellow employees, right? All the other aspects of our lives, there's a disconnect from the image that we are portraying on the outside to what is actually going on in the inside. And Jesus says this is the problem with the Pharisees. It's a false religion where you care more about your ego, you care more about your image, you care more about going through the motions than you do about genuinely and sincerely honoring God. What people think about you matters more than what God thinks about you. What people see in the public matters more to you than what God sees in private. And Jesus said this mindset is at the heart of false religion. We actually see a very sobering example of this in the book of Acts in the early church. In Acts chapter 5, there's a married couple named Ananias and Sapphira. And if you know the story, you know it is a very sobering story because the early Christians came together and they were actually selling real estate, selling property, and they were bringing the proceeds to give to the church to be able to take care of the poor, right? And there was this beautiful picture of unity where people were all in to be about what God was about and the furthering of his kingdom. And yet there's this one couple, Ananias and Sapphira, and it says that they go and they had a piece of land and they sell it for a certain sum. But when they come and they bring the proceeds, they tell the apostles that they sold it for a different sum, a smaller sum. In other words, they kept back some of the proceeds for themselves, which by the way, they could have done that. It was their money, it was their property. They were not obligated to sell and give all of it to the church. And yet they did it, they sold the land and they told the apostles that they sold it for a sum that was actually different from the true sum that they sold it for because they kept back some of the proceeds for themselves. And the apostle Peter calls them out and actually says, you are lying to the Holy Spirit. This spirit of deception, of outwardly wanting to appear righteous, but inwardly there is a selfishness, there was a greed, there was a deceit. And it says both of them on separate occasions, they ultimately dropped dead under God's judgment. Now, here's what I'm saying. Here's what I'm not saying. That if you're a hypocrite, God is going to strike you down. I'm not saying that because all of us would be dead, let's be honest. What I'm saying is in the early church, God was setting a precedent that this false idea of religion, this deception, lying to God, portraying one thing and being something else was not going to be acceptable. And I'm not saying that our outward appearance shouldn't matter because let me just say this. In fact, the outward appearance of the church has done enough harm in our culture. We should care as Christians how people perceive us, not because of our reputation or ego, but because we want to honor God. If we claim to be a Christian, we are representing Christ. So how we treat people, how we interact in the world around us should be a concern. Because we want to honor God and we want to point people to him in a way that is sincere. We don't want to dishonor him. We don't want to be hypocrites that actually cause a barrier or a stumbling block for people being able to experience the goodness of Jesus. So we should care. What I'm saying is that if there is a disconnect between our outward appearance and our private lives, then we've missed the point. That if we're only concerned with our reputation, if we're only concerned with our ego, if we're only concerned with what people think of us, then we've missed the heart of Christianity, which is ultimately about wanting to honor God in every sphere of our lives. To truly and sincerely live a life that is pleasing to him, whether anyone else sees it or not, whether we get acknowledgement or the praise of people or not, because we care more about what God thinks than we do about what people think. Jesus closes this passage with the final woe in verse 29. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in the shedding of the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore, I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." Now this is a lot here, but this is Jesus' greatest indictment against the religious leaders. Because Israel had this long, painful past history of rejecting the prophets that God had sent to them. See, God would send them prophets to call them back to repentance, to remind them of God's covenant love to them, to call them back out of their disobedience generation after generation. And what Jesus is talking about is this long, painful history where Israel, the people of God, had rejected the voice of God through his prophets. And not only simply rejected them, but oftentimes persecuted them, and in many occasions even killed them. And what these religious leaders were saying is, we are not like them. We would not have done that. If we were in the past, we would not have responded that way because we love God. We want to honor God. We would have responded appropriately and obediently to God. We're nothing like them. And Jesus says, you're exactly like them. And here's the irony. What they were saying is if they had been in the past, they would have recognized the voice of God and they would have responded appropriately. And Jesus says, if that is true, then you would have recognized who is standing in front of you and who is speaking to you right now. See, Jesus is the ultimate prophet, the ultimate revelation of God, God himself, the very Son of God in the flesh, Jesus who is speaking to them, and yet they don't recognize him. They don't recognize him because Jesus knows they've already rejected him. Jesus knows they've already opposed him. Jesus knows they've already conspired against him. And Jesus knows ultimately these are the individuals who will end up crucifying him. And he says, you're exactly like your fathers. You've missed the revelation of God in front of you. You are deaf to the voice of God. You have hardened your hearts. And so here's the final thing. False religion is self-assured, but ignores the voice of God. False religion is self-assured, but ignores the voice of God. See, this is the person who is confident in themselves, right? They're confident in their righteousness. They're confident that they truly know God, that they have a relationship with God, that they're in right standing with God, and yet they completely ignore the glaring truth that is in front of them. That they're in rebellion, that they're in disobedience, that their hearts have been hardened, that they've turned off their ears from being able to hear God's voice, that this is the person who has little to no spiritual self-awareness. And let me just say this, self-confidence without self-reflection is dangerous. This is true in every aspect, in your marriage, in your work and leadership, but it is most deadly when it comes to our faith. Self-confidence without self-reflection can lead to destruction. Because in our minds, when we judge ourselves based on our standards of what is good or what is right, and we've actually not realized that we've hardened ourselves to God, that we no longer hear his voice and we're no longer responding to his calls upon our life. We're no longer sensitive to the Spirit. It's a dangerous place to be when we've judged ourselves worthy rather than allowing God to judge us, rather than opening ourselves up in humility before God. It's why the Apostle Paul, he said these words to the Corinthian church, which was quite honestly a pretty messed up church. They had a lot of stuff going on, and he said this to them. He said, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Or do you not realize this about yourselves, that Jesus Christ is in you, unless indeed you fail to meet the test? What was Paul saying there? He was saying, don't be so self-confident that you're not being introspective, that you're not reflecting, that you're not having a sensitive, humble posture before God. To say, God, is there stuff in my life that you've been trying to address and I've been ignoring you? Are there sins that I'm committing and living in that maybe I've justified or I've excused, or maybe I just don't see it? Are there things that you've called me to do that I've continuously ignored? Jesus says that is the posture that we should have. To walk in humility, to walk in openness, a surrendered posture. But it's a dangerous place to live with a hard heart, to live with a posture where we're not willing to hear from God and yet still claim to be a Christian, while living life for ourselves, while doing the things that we want to do, completely ignorant to the voice of God. To not have a posture of surrender, to not have a posture of submission. Jesus is saying, don't be so self-confident and so self-assured that it eliminates your ability to hear from God and see what he wants to show you. Soften your heart, humble yourself. See, the truth today is this is a challenging message. Jesus pulls no punches in his words to these religious leaders, but I think that we can learn from them. You see, we've met, many of us, people who exhibit these behaviors, and some of you, as I said before, have been hurt by them. And what I would say to you is the good news is Jesus didn't do that to you. The very people that he rebuked are the type of people that did that to you. The very people that Jesus called out are the ones that did that to you, not Jesus, because it doesn't represent his heart. But I also gotta be honest, here's the bad news. All of us have done some of these at some level. All of us have fallen prey to some level of hypocrisy in our Christianity. But here's the invitation, what Jesus truly wants. He wants to invite us into a deeper, more honest, more sincere faith. One that permeates every area of our lives. One that transforms every area of our lives. If we are willing to humble ourselves, if we're willing to be honest, and that's where I want to end today. What are the things that we should do in response to this? Just a few simple things. Just be honest. Be honest about the places where you've failed, because all of us have failed. Be honest about the places where you've been a hypocrite. This is not to shame. This is not to condemn. This is to invite you into a place of honesty and transparency. Just to be honest about where you are and confess that to God and repent of it. Say, God, I know these are the areas where I've not lived according to the way that you've called me to live. These are the areas where my outer life has been disconnected from what's going on inside, my public life and my private life. And God, would you help me to change those areas? Ask God to search you and reveal the truth. The prayer of David to search me. God, search me out. Expose the parts of me that I'm not even aware of right now. Would you reveal those to me? Would you reveal the areas of my life that I'm in error? Would you reveal the areas of my life that I'm in rebellion to you? Would you show me? And then lastly, surrender all aspects of your life to God. If you know that there's parts of your life that you've withheld, that you've kept to yourself, surrender that to God. Say, God, you can have this part of my life. God, I want you to have every aspect of my life. I want you to have your way in my life and through my life. Would you bow your heads as I pray? God, we thank you for your word. Though it is true that many times it is challenging, hard-hitting, and convicting, God, I pray most of all that we would always see it as an invitation to know you at a more sincere, deeper level. And I pray today that we would simply be encouraged at the fact that none of us have met the standard. That's why Jesus came. That we need your grace, we need your mercy, we need your forgiveness. Because all of us to some degree, we've missed the mark. All of us at some degree have not lived up to our convictions. We've not lived up to our beliefs. And yet, God, that's what we want. In sincerity, God, we want to honor you with the whole of our lives, in our thoughts, in our words, in our heart posture, in our motivations, in our actions, in our treatment of other people, in our concern for wanting to honor you more than caring about what people think of us. God, I pray today that through your Spirit, you would bring change, bring transformation, bring revelation. God, reveal things to us that we need to see. Bring conviction, areas of our lives that we need to change. But we recognize, God, even then, we can't do that without your help. And so we ask, God, would you help us? Would you help us to be the people that represent you well in the world? Not because we're concerned about our image, but because we want to truly honor and glorify you. God, help us to change the cultural mindset of Christianity. That Christianity isn't just about a bunch of religious hypocrites. Yes, God, we fail. Yes, God, we fall short. But I pray that when people interact with us, that they would see you, that they would see your love, that they would see your heart. God, that there would be a deeper sincerity to give every single aspect and part of our lives to you. And so God, we surrender that to you in this moment. We thank you that your grace is enough even in our failure and in our shortcoming. And we thank you, God, that you've not left us simply in our sin, but that you're doing a work of healing and a work of transformation in the lives of all those who would call upon you, in the lives of all those who would trust you and dare to follow you, even in the midst of the struggle, even in the midst of the difficulty. God, you meet us there, and we thank you for that. And we pray all these things in the name of Jesus, amen.